Here's a claim that might make your high school history teacher uncomfortable. Some of the most historically accurate literature being written right now involves dragons. I'm serious. Marie Brennan's Memoirs of Lady Trent, a Victorian-esque fantasy series about a female scientist who travels the world studying dragons, gets something true about history that most so-called realistic historical fiction completely misses. It understands that women were always there, doing the intellectual work, making the discoveries, writing the books, and then history just erased them. Today we're reading between the lines of Brennan's fiction to find the real women hiding inside it. So who is Marie Brennan, and why should you care? She's a novelist, short story writer, and this is genuinely a sentence that exists, the only currently active Hugo Award-winning poet in speculative fiction. She's best known for the Memoirs of Lady Trent, a 5-book series framed as the elderly memoirs of Isabella Camherst, Lady Trent, the world's foremost dragonologist. Think Victorian naturalist memoir, think Darwin's journals or Mary Kingsley's travel writing, but with actual dragons instead of beetles. And here's the thing that makes Brennan's work so fascinating from a literary standpoint. Her background isn't creative writing. It's anthropology and folklore. She spent 6 years in graduate school studying how human cultures construct meaning through story, ritual, and belief. That's not a footnote to her fiction, that's the engine of it. Every society Isabella visits in Lady Trent operates according to its own internal logic, its own folklore about dragons, its own rules about what women are allowed to know and say and discover. And we need this series right now. In a moment when women in STEM are still fighting for recognition, when historical curricula are actively being debated, when we're arguing about whose stories get told, Brennan is doing something quietly radical. She's writing the corrected version of history. Not the version that happened, but the version that should have been allowed to happen. And that distinction is where all the literary power lies. Let's dig into the core insight. The Memoirs of Lady Trent is written as a retrospective, an elderly Isabella narrating her younger self's adventures from the vantage of late-life fame and hard-won respect. That framing device is doing enormous work, because real Victorian women scientists, and there were many, often published their work under male pseudonyms, attributed their discoveries to husbands or brothers, or found their contributions quietly absorbed into men's papers. The memoir format insists she was there, she did this, her name goes on it. Think about the women this mirrors. Mary Anning spent decades pulling ichthyosaur and plesiosaur fossils out of the cliffs at Lyme Regis. She essentially founded paleontology. She is the woman behind the tongue twister she sells seashells by the seashore. And the Geological Society of London refused her membership because she was a woman. Her discoveries were published by men who paid her a few shillings for the bones. Sound familiar? Isabella Camherst, in her fictional world, faces almost exactly this structure. In the first book, A Natural History of Dragons, Isabella describes her childhood obsession with the creatures dismissed as curiosity, not scholarship. I was not supposed to want this, she tells us. Girls of my station collected embroidery and accomplishments. I collected field guides and dead specimens. What Brennan is encoding here is the specific texture of intellectual desire in women who aren't supposed to have it. That hunger, documented, articulated, retrospectively claimed, is the emotional core of the whole series. And crucially, Brennan doesn't let Isabella off easy. She makes mistakes. She gets things wrong scientifically. She holds biases she has to consciously unlearn. This is actually a sophisticated literary choice because the women scientist history did erase were, like all scientists, imperfect thinkers working with incomplete information. By making Isabella fallible, Brennan resists the counter-trap of creating a feminist superhero instead of a feminist human being. The genius is that fallibility makes the eventual recognition feel earned rather than given. Here's where Brennan's anthropology training becomes unmistakably visible. Each region Isabella travels to, modeled on real-world cultures with genuine structural research behind them, treats dragons differently. One culture reveres them as divine. Another hunts them for medicine. A third has built an entire agricultural system around their migratory patterns. What Isabella keeps confronting is the idea that scientific truth is always filtered through cultural story. You cannot see a creature cleanly when your society has handed you a mythology about it first. This is real anthropological theory, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Mary Douglas, smuggled into dragon adventure fiction. And this is where we get to the second hidden argument running beneath the whole series. Dragons aren't just dragons. They're knowledge itself, specifically, knowledge that power structures have decided certain people aren't supposed to have. Every time Isabella studies a dragon, she is claiming intellectual territory that her society tells her belongs to men, to institutions, to the credentialed. The series is, at its heart, about who gets to be an expert, who gets to name things, who gets to write the natural history. The epistolary memoir format, Isabella narrating from old age, adds one more layer. She survived. She won. By the time we're reading, the ending is already good. And Brennan uses that narrative safety to let the tension of the journey breathe, because we know Isabella persists through every obstacle, every dismissal, every moment someone tells her to go home. That retrospective confidence is its own political statement. It says, women like this exist. They endure. They write their own account. So where does this connect to the world we're living in right now? Everywhere, honestly. We are in a moment of intense debate about what stories get canonized, whose expertise gets trusted, which histories get taught. The Memoirs of Lady Trent participates in a much larger literary movement. Think N. K. Jemisin, Naomi Novik's Temeraire. Zen chose Sorcerer to the Crown. That uses the conventions of European high fantasy not to celebrate those traditions uncritically, but to interrogate who got left out of them. Brennan's panel discussion, A Voice of Her Own, the portrayal of women and girls in historical fiction, gets at exactly this tension. Historical fiction carries a unique burden. It can either replicate the erasures of actual history, or it can consciously restore what was lost. The most interesting writers working today, and Brennan is absolutely among them, have chosen restoration. Not falsification, not wish fulfillment, but imaginative reparation. Think about how Bridgerton sparked a mainstream conversation about diverse casting in Regency settings, or how The Favourite reimagined Queen Anne's court as a space of female political ambition. Audiences are hungry, ravenous, actually, for historical narratives that let women be the full complexity of human beings rather than props or victims. Brennan has been doing this work in speculative fiction for years, building that bridge between rigorous historical texture and genuine female interiority. And her collaboration with Alec Helms, writing as M. A. Carrick on the Rook and Rose trilogy, takes this even further, an epic fantasy built around questions of colonialism, identity, and resistance, where the politics are as intricate as any Le Carré novel. The two writers bring complementary intellectual frameworks, Brennan's anthropology, Helms's theater background, and the result is world-building that feels genuinely inhabited rather than decorated. The connections between how power works in that fictional world and how it works in ours are impossible to miss once you start looking. All right, here's the moment I've been waiting to get to. I bet you didn't know this. The woman who writes some of the most meticulous, intellectually precise historical fantasy of the last 2 decades also just earned her second-degree black belt in karate. And she's a Hugo Award-winning poet. And she runs a long-standing Patreon series about speculative fiction world-building. We're talking about someone who is herself, practicing the polymathic ambition she gives Isabella Camherst, the refusal to be only one thing, to stay in one box. That's not a cute coincidence. That's the thesis made flesh. Every artist who operates from a genuine intellectual biography brings that biography into their fiction, whether they intend to or not. Isabella's insatiable curiosity about dragons, her willingness to learn sword fighting, study foreign languages, challenge senior scientists, is recognizably the curiosity of the person who made her. The character and the author are engaged in the same project. And here's the literary historical twist that brings us full circle. Brennan grew up in Texas, went to college in Massachusetts, did her graduate work in Indiana. She's lived exactly the kind of peripatetic intellectual life, she writes, rootlessness transformed into expertise, crossing categories rather than staying in one. Mary Anning never left Lyme Regis. Isabella Trent left everywhere she started. Brennan, the author behind them both, understood that the most dangerous thing a woman intellectual can do is refuse to stay put. So what do we actually take away from all of this? When we read the Memoirs of Lady Trent as straightforward fantasy adventure, fun, clever, beautifully crafted, we're only reading the surface. Underneath is a sustained argument about historical epistemology, who gets to produce knowledge, whose knowledge gets preserved, and what form that preservation takes. The memoir isn't just a narrative device. It's a model for how women have had to survive their own erasure, by writing themselves back into existence before someone else writes them out. The dragons, in the end, are almost beside the point, or rather, they are precisely the point. They represent all the knowledge that polite society tells ambitious women they aren't allowed to chase. The field expedition you shouldn't go on. The paper you shouldn't publish. The discovery that gets handed to the man standing nearest you. Every time Isabella looks a dragon in the eye, she's doing something that real women in real history were prevented from doing. And the fantasy lets us feel viscerally what that costs and what it's worth. Reading Brennan changes something. Once you understand the Margaret Anning underneath Isabella Trent, you start seeing her everywhere, in every historical novel where a woman has to fight for the right to simply know things. You start reading differently. You start asking, who wrote this? Whose voice is missing? Whose name was left off the paper? That's the gift of a writer who comes from anthropology and folklore. She teaches you to read the world the way she reads it, for what's between the lines. If this changed how you think about historical fantasy, and about the real women it's quietly honoring, you'll love our video on Naomi Novik's Uprooted and what it reveals about fairy tale heroines who refuse the expected ending. And if you want to go deeper on the women's science erased, our breakdown of the real Mary Anning and how her story became a ghost-haunting English literature is waiting for you right now. Drop a comment telling us, which woman from history deserves her own Lady Trent moment? We read every single one.